The photo op bears an obvious message. France's president jetting from Cairo to the Sinai, near the border with Gaza, to show that Europe's not forgotten the plight of Palestinians who are back under daily bombardments since the collapse of last month's ceasefire with Israel. But was there perhaps a more subtle message for Binyamin Netanyahu? Emmanuel Macron near the border the same day that Israel's Supreme Court rules whether the prime minister unfairly wants to dismiss the head of the Shin Bet intelligence service that just happens to have launched a probe into Netanyahu media advisors allegedly on the take from Qatar. Are the pair behind a disinformation campaign against Egypt with false claims of a troop buildup at the Gaza border? Either way, France's president standing by Egypt. Now, just 24 hours ago, we would have been asking, why should Netanyahu care what Macron thinks as long as Donald Trump has his back? But that was before a kind of awkward visit late Monday to the White House. Did the U.S. president catch his guest off guard when he announced the reopening of talks with Iran or praised a Syria rival Turkey? And what about that phone call Trump had before meeting Netanyahu with a certain Emmanuel Macron? Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about Macron's Sinai signaling, and with us, he's former French ambassador to Qatar and Saudi Arabia, Bertrand Besancenot, today in the risk consultancy business. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Also with us, Middle East watcher Eberhard Kienle, research professor at France's National Research Center, the CNRS. Your latest book, Egypt, a Fragile Power. Welcome back to the show.
Question mark.
Question mark. Let's not forget the question mark. We like question marks on the show. With us from the heights of Delphi in Greece, Nomi Bar-Yaakov, Associate Fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy's Global Fellowship Initiative. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me on the show, Francois.
And from Barcelona, Timothy Caldas, Deputy Director at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. How are you, sir?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
In ever-growing numbers, you're listening, liking, and subscribing to the France 24 debate, wherever podcasts are streamed. It's just 50 kilometers away from the Gaza border. Emmanuel Macron and his Egyptian host Abdel Fattah al-Sisi traveling to Al Arish, a key transit point for Gaza-bound aid. The French president handing out roses to Palestinian patients in hospital, also visiting a play area for children, and pushing for the reopening of crossing points for the delivery of humanitarian goods into Gaza. Gaza, where Macron says the situation's intolerable.
The situation today is untenable and has never been so serious. It's never been so serious because since October 7th, when this war began, and since October 8th, the humanitarian situation in Gaza has been critical. And because there's never been a period of complete blockade for this long, both in terms of humanitarian aid and in terms of medicines, of care, and of those most at risk unable to leave. And this is the priority for us.
There have been other European officials, Bertrand Besancenot, who've gone to this key transit point near the Gaza border. But the French president going at this moment, your thoughts on that?
Oh, this is something new because there has been other leaders going to Gaza or all around. The problem is that we are now in a very dramatic situation nowadays in terms of humanitarian situation. And it is important that at least some leaders are putting the finger on the real situation on the spot. And it is also an opportunity for political reason to support the Egyptian government, who will have an important role in trying to find a solution to the Gaza crisis. And also, it is a signal for the Americans that others are involved in this process, and they want to give their hand, in particular, to what is called the Arab Plan for reconstruction of Gaza. If the Arabs are alone, it would be seen as something different, as if there are other main players that have something to say and are supporting this initiative. So it is a mixture of humanitarian priority, urgency, I would say, but also a political signal to several different people.
Timothy Caldas, is it just a photo op when the French president goes to the Sinai?
I think it really remains to be seen. It depends on what kind of actions are backing up this visit. We've heard Macron take a strong position at times on what's happening in Gaza and the humanitarian situation and the needs of the Palestinians, which is extremely dire. But at the same time, we've seen the French government cast doubt on whether or not they will adhere to their obligations as members of the ICC to enforce an arrest warrant on Prime Minister Netanyahu, who flew over France unimpeded on his way to Washington just over the weekend. So there's a question mark about whether or not France is serious, whether or not Europe is serious about applying what pressure is available to it on the Israeli government to press them to adhere to the ceasefire and allow humanitarian aid in compliance with their international legal obligations.
Nomi Bar Yaakov, at this point in time, since the breakdown in mid-March of the ceasefire in Gaza, is there any respite ahead? We've had, more stories about journalists being targeted, about aid workers being targeted in Gaza.
Yes, I think the situation is utterly dire, and there are a large number of deaths in Gaza every day, including journalists, aid workers, children, women, and it's going on basically with the world remaining silent. So I think it is very important that Macron is in Egypt at the moment, and I don't think it's just a photo op or lip service. Egypt has come up with its own proposal now for a ceasefire, the release of 7 living hostages and a 70-day ceasefire, increased aid. It's a very serious proposal. It's not, just one more proposal. This is, we're at a break point here. Gazans are starving and being bombarded. Aid isn't coming. It's not only that aid isn't coming in, you've got no electricity. I mean, the humanitarian situation is beyond dire. And I think it's very important that that Macron, as a leader of one of the big and important European countries, shows support to Egypt, not just for the ceasefire proposal, but as Bertrand said, it's really important to support the Arab plan launched by Egypt, or spearheaded by Egypt. The Arab plan for reconstruction is a very serious plan on the table. It's not perfect, but it is a plan to reconstruct, to end the war, have all the hostages released, bring stability, have Israel withdraw from Gaza. It includes specific plans for a Palestinian technocratic interim government. It discusses who will govern, who will deal with security aid and all the likes, and it needs European support. And I'm sure that that is very much on the table. Whereas Israel is it's pretty clear that Israel at the same time is doing everything it can to try to ensure that Trump's plan to ethnically cleanse all of Gaza will prevail. So there is a serious, issue here hanging in the balance between the two plans. One plan is to cleanse Gaza of Palestinians and create a Riviera, and of course they will have to go through Egypt because they only have a border with Egypt and Israel. And the other, the other plan is the Egyptian plan. And I think it's important that Macron familiarizes himself with the nitty-gritty bits of the plan and gives it its utmost support, because Trump is clearly pivoting. And now he's meeting, or he's sending Witkoff to meet with Abbas Arachi. Yes.
We'll talk about the Iranians in a second. Eberhard
Yes,
Kingler, in
no
fact,
problem.
there are in fact 2 Egypt plans, because in the long term, in the short term, they're pushing the idea of a 70-day truce for Gaza. How much weight at this point in time does Cairo have in all of this?
Well, my judgment is reserved about the weight of Cairo as much as the weight of Amman, of Jordan, and of France. For the moment, we see a welcome gesture, definitely, and I think nobody else has been as far as President Macron to El Arish, a place which, in fact, incidentally, has a long history, and a history also in the Arab-Israeli conflict, one of the places from which the Israelis didn't want to withdraw after the Camp David agreements. So there may be a hidden symbolic value somewhere, but I think it's not. It's simply because it's very close to the Gaza border. So I think France has certainly, the initiative is certainly welcome, but the question is, what is the weight of France? What is the weight of Egypt? What is the weight of Amman, of Jordan? If we consider it in balance with the United States, and despite some of the, say, misfortunes that Netanyahu had in Washington recently, nonetheless, it seems to me that the American-Israeli alliance seems to be very strong still, despite that. So, in the end, I'm afraid that, this will possibly remain a gesture. Also, perhaps to add that it's a humanitarian visit to El Arish, largely. Of course, there is the plan for Gaza, but the emphasis during this visit is on humanitarian issues, not on political issues. When we talk about Palestine, when we talk about Gaza these days, in Europe and in America, of course, but we talk about, at best, humanitarian issues, but very rarely about political issues. They are always in the background, and that's important to remember.
No, I agree with you, but at the same time, there are two different things. There is a real urgency in terms of humanitarian assistance for the Gazian people. But at the same time, you had also this summit by the three leaders, and with
the summit with the King of Jordan and the Egyptian president on Monday.
A joint declaration, which is extremely interesting because it puts the elements that have to be presented to President Trump. And we know that we are in a period where everybody in the region is looking at what President Trump will do or not do. So it is a time where it is important to try to attract his attention, to make some kind of pressure. There is no other word. So the simple fact that President Macron, the King Abdullah, and President Sisi called Trump just before the meeting with Netanyahu, I think is important because at the end of the day, everybody knows that what Trump will do or not do will be a major factor. This is clear. So it is important to have some pressure on the man who is the one who has the big cards in his hands. So I think it was not only a humanitarian visit. You had the two aspects, and the political one is important. There is a priority, which is to tackle how we can organize a post-war Gaza. This is one aspect. But there is, of course, the mid-term or the long-term question, which is what kind of fair solution you can find for the Palestinian issue. Otherwise, it will mean that we will have different 7 October every 2-3 years. So I think it is important to have this kind of both humanitarian but also political.
I may have not made myself understood. Obviously, I mean, this is a political visit to Cairo, clearly, and I completely agree. I was just saying that the visit to El Arish is largely humanitarian. Oh, yes, it's symbolic. Right. And that's what the focus is on at the moment. And I'm afraid that maybe the other issues will, of course, reach President Trump's ears, but that may change again very quickly. So I'm not so sure about the lasting impact.
What is certain is that the U.S. president took that call when Emmanuel Macron picked up the phone in the company of the King of Jordan and the President of Egypt. And the timing could not have been more auspicious. It was just before Trump welcomed the Israeli Prime Minister to the White House Monday evening, in a seemingly hastily organized second trip already by Binyamin Netanyahu to Washington since January 20th. Netanyahu did not get the lifting of the 17% tariffs on Israel that he wanted. What he did get was front row seats to an exclusive.
We're dealing with the Iranians. We have a very big meeting on Saturday, and we're dealing with them directly. I think if the talks aren't successful with Iran, I think Iran is going to be in great danger, and I hate to say it, great danger, because they can't have a nuclear weapon.
Nomi Bar Yaakov, we keenly watched back the exchange there in the Oval Office. Benjamin Netanyahu keeping a poker face throughout. Do you think he was caught off guard?
Yes, I think he was caught off guard. I think he went to Washington thinking that he'll manage to negotiate a deal and erase the 17% tariffs that President Trump had imposed on Israel. I think he was hoping to get a green light to bomb Iran with the US. And I think those were and also I think he was hoping to pursue the original Trump plan, which is to ethnically cleanse Gaza from Palestinians and construct a Riviera for profit, for Western profit.
And there was also, at one point, a comment by the U.S. president saying, any problem you have with Turkey, I think we can solve. As long as you are reasonable, you have to be reasonable, he said to Netanyahu.
Thank you for reminding me of that. So that was the fourth issue, and all four very serious issues, is that Netanyahu was hoping that he would get support from President Trump to curb Turkish influence in mainly in Syria, but also more broadly in the region, and also for Hamas. And in fact, President Trump spoke of how highly he thinks of Erdogan and how much respect he has for him. So I think, yes, that was absolute a fourth bombshell.
Timothy called us. Please explain to us what happened on Monday at the White House.
I think there's often a temptation to conflate Trump's very pro-Israeli positions on a number of issues, like moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem and things of this sort, with an assumption that he's just has an Orthodox American support for everything that the Israelis do, and he's a bit more all over the place in that respect, and so sometimes he can conjure up surprises like what we saw in the Oval Office. I think when he sees opportunities that suit him, he'll pursue them irrespective of whether or not it makes Netanyahu happy. Even ahead of him resuming the presidency, when Witkoff was in the region working with the Biden administration to negotiate a ceasefire, we had reports of Witkoff showing up in Israel during Shabbat, insisting on meeting Netanyahu while his staff tried to delay the meeting, and basically forcing his way in a manner of forcefulness that we had not seen throughout the duration of Biden's presidency. And so I think that while Trump's commitment to the humanitarian well-being of the Palestinians is borderline non-existent, his deference to Netanyahu is also not as robust as some people might assume. I think that he's an independent player who could surprise us, as he did surprise Netanyahu in the Oval Office. Also, as for his ethnic cleansing proposal during the previous meeting, I think that the kind of universal rejection of that idea from his Gulf allies, the Europeans, and from Egypt and Jordan, kind of has led him in a direction where I don't know that he has sold on the idea or is convinced that he's going to pull it off. He gestures to it every now and again, but I'm cautiously optimistic that that particular idea he might be disabused of. Although my worry that the Israelis might try to actualize it anyways, and then try to position Trump as having to say, well, this was my idea all along.
All right, so Trump is capable of reading the room. What about when Ambassador Besancenot was expressing concern aloud that Trump took that stance just after that phone call with the tripartite summit in Cairo, and that Trump can be swayed by the last person he's spoken to on the phone?
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, that's something we've seen consistently throughout his first term and certainly into this one. We saw it after meetings with Erdogan. We saw it with Macron, where they were very warm with each other during his first term, and we saw a resumption of that in the last visit. But he's a very, for better or for worse, very unpredictable, and that also creates a lot of challenges, because just because he can be swayed by the last phone call doesn't mean he won't be swayed by the next. And so I think a lot of leaders have a lot of concerns about how reliable any of these commitments or statements can be. And one of the unique challenges of the Trump presidency, both the first and second term, is that you kind of have to wonder each time the president says something whether or not you have to take it seriously, which is not something that I think most people are accustomed to when dealing with the U.S. president.
All right. So again, Nomi Bar Yaakov, tariffs, Iran, Turkey, that trifecta of setbacks has the Times of Israel turning to baseball analogies, saying that the Israeli prime minister struck out at the White House. But, and we heard there Timothy Caldas mention it, you did also hear the U.S. president talk about the Gaza Strip as fabulous oceanfront real estate. So there's limits to how much he's throwing Netanyahu under the bus.
Well, we don't know. He pivots. I don't know what the limit is, because I don't know what he's actually going to do. I think, he's somewhat unpredictable in that regard. And as Timothy said, we know from Trump 1 that he basically reiterates what the last person who whispered in his ear says. And that, is why that call that, from the trilateral meeting was so important. And I think it did make a difference. I suddenly got, a message on my phone, a number of them, that the press conference is cancelled, the one that actually you just aired. So it's not clear how Trump is going to react. And I think he does want to see an end of war. And I think, if the Egyptian plan can be actualized, then clearly the Egyptian and Arab League, the plan has been endorsed by the entire Arab League, and it was negotiated in Riyadh. So it's a Saudi, Egyptian, Arab League plan. And I think, it can be implemented, but it needs a strong Europe, and it needs the US behind it. And that's where we're at. Netanyahu is trying to act. Israel is taking the Trump proposal to ethnically cleanse Gaza very seriously. They created a ministerial body to actualize it. So it's very, very serious. And I think it's really, again, very, very important that Macron and other European leaders give full backing to the Arab plan and make it happen. It's not just about verbal backing, it's about implementing it.
Bertrand Besancenot, very briefly on this point. How should Europe, how should France view these what are probably going to be indirect talks happening this Saturday in Oman between the United States and Iran?
Oh, we knew that President Trump doesn't want to commit US forces in the Middle East anymore, if he can. So for that reason, he made very clear, I think, to Netanyahu from the beginning that he preferred a diplomatic solution, taking into account the fact that the Iranians were in a very difficult situation nowadays, both economically, politically, and having lost their jokers in the region. So he feels that, as he's supposed to be the master of the deals, that he can use this opportunity to have a better deal than the one in 2015. So this is his priority for the time being. So he used the Romani as a mediator. At some point, it was said that it might be the President Putin. So we don't know exactly how he will deal if the Europeans or the Gulf countries will be involved. But I'm sure that, for example, and we'll talk certainly about Saudi Arabia a bit later, but it is clear that the Saudis and the Gulf countries want to be involved in whatever arrangement will be done between the US and Iran. They don't want to go like what happened in 2015, and they have their good reason. So we have two dealers, President Trump, but also Mohammed bin Salman is a dealer as well. So we will see that.
The Saudi foreign minister in Washington announced in Washington this Tuesday, Eberhard Kindle. Yeah, the question is that is that, again, is this a separate initiative, or is this in lockstep with what the Egyptians have on?
Well, I don't quite know, to be very honest, but it seems to me very obvious that at this particular moment, everybody wants to have some say in that matter. So whether this is coordinated or not, I'm not privy to these conversations, but everybody wants to have some say in what will happen in Gaza for whatever reason. Now, the question is that, of course, the Saudis want to be involved, the Egyptians want to be involved, the Europeans want to be involved, but the question is, first, once again, will they be heard in Washington, D.C.? Will they be heard in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem? And I'm not that sure about it. And second, of course, the question is, this is a lot of money. At some stage, that plan was put at 53. I mean, this is, of course, these figures are completely, they're just approximative. You have 53 billion US dollars. I don't know quite how this was calculated, but this is money. And money is not that, well, it's rare these days. The Europeans will not pay for it. The Americans don't want to pay for it. President Trump reminds Netanyahu of the American gifts to the Israeli government. And
traditionally, when it comes to rebuilding the Gaza Strip, it's been the Gulf states.
Yeah. Well, yes, but with the oil price falling these days, and with a long history of rising debt in some of these countries and attempts to save money rather than spend money, I'm not quite sure where the money will come from.
No, if I may add one thing, President Trump made very clear that his priority in the Middle East was to get a recognition from Saudi Arabia to Israel. And why is it so important for him? he wants to disengage, if I may say, the American forces from the region because he has other priorities. And for that, he wants to build something between a kind of coalition between Israel and the Gulf countries, which implies, by definition, that there would be a recognition of Israel by Saudi Arabia. But Mohammed bin Salman is also a dealer, so he has a transactional concept, how to deal with the Trump administration. So we know that there will be a big debate, not only on oil, because this is another factor of discussion, but on Palestine, at a time where Prince Mohammed bin Salman knows that he will be the next guardian of the Holy See, or the Holy Mosque. And by definition, he wants to appear as somebody who got something for the Palestinians because he knows what are the public opinion. So it will be a very interesting deal between Trump and Mohammed bin Salman at some point on Palestine.
Timothy Caldas?
Yeah, I just also wanted to add another concern that the Gulf states have raised about paying for rebuilding Gaza is that each time they've done it in the past, the Israelis have proceeded to destroy it. And so one of the things that they've been insisting on is that any future investment in reconstruction be paired with a political process that actually brings us to a two-state solution. I think that and this comes back to Eberhard's point, without a political solution, we're just temporarily getting a respite from the violence that has ravaged Gaza for much of the last nearly 2 decades. And the Israelis kind of consistently go in with very heavy-handed approaches, destroy large sections of the Gaza Strip, kill some number of people, obviously this time more than ever before. And then other people foot the bill. The Israelis never pay anything for it. And so the Gulf states, I think, are saying, if you want us to be covering this time, we want to see something that's durable. We want to see something that's sustainable. We don't want to have to be on hold again in a few years. And I think it's not an unreasonable question. At the same time, you have obviously 2 million people living in the midst of all of this who are suffering incredibly. And these political debates, while they're very important, don't end the humanitarian suffering that's happening right now.
The humanitarian suffering that the French president was talking about earlier in the Sinai. But there was perhaps another message Emmanuel Macron was sending from there, and that is support and getting the cameras to show that there are no troops where he is. That's because there has been fake news that's been disinformation that's been spread lately that said that there was some kind of a troop buildup of Egyptian officials accusing Israel of stoking tensions with that false claim, saying it's a threat to the peace treaty between their two countries since the Camp David Accord. Media advisors to the prime minister accused of planting and or stoking those rumors as part of what the Israelis are calling Qatargate. They were the subject of a treason probe by the head of domestic intelligence, and now the prime minister wants him sacked. The Supreme Court hearing the case, it was heated. Emerald Maxwell has that story.
The disruption began even before the judges had entered the courtroom, with protesters shouting, "You have no authority," and "shame." Supporters of Binyamin Netanyahu's decision to fire Ronen Bar, like this protester, who accuses Bar, as head of Israel's internal security service, of being responsible for the death of his son, a soldier killed in Gaza. The judges eventually ordered the court cleared and resumed an hour later without an audience. They're considering petitions by opposition and non-profit groups that challenge the legality of the government's move.
A government decision was made to terminate the appointment of the head of the Shin Bet, Ronen Bar, before he had completed his term of office. This is an unprecedented event in the history of the country.
Netanyahu said last month that he'd lost confidence in Bar over Shin Bet's failure to prevent the October 7th attack. But critics say the real reason for Bar's dismissal was that Netanyahu demanded loyalty from the head of an organisation that is meant to be apolitical, an organisation that was also investigating possible ties between Netanyahu aides and Qatar.
The accusation that Qatar government basically gave money to the Netanyahu personal assistants in order to control the messages that go out of Netanyahu's chamber. We're saying that firing Ronen Bar today is against the law because of Netanyahu conflict of interest.
The latest showdown between Netanyahu and the judiciary has deepened a rift in Israeli society over the power of the courts.
The judges are acting without authority. The case is 100% within the government's authority.
The government's proposal to reform the judiciary has regularly drawn hundreds of thousands of Israelis onto the streets in protest.
Nomi Bar Yaakov, ever since October the 7th, we've been hearing each time there was some effort at a truce of Qatari and Egyptian efforts. Is there a rivalry there? Is that also part of Qatargate, that somehow a bid not just by Israel to sideline the Egyptians?
No, I wouldn't say that the rivalry is between Qatar and Egypt. I would say that the rivalry is between Israel and peace. Israel is doing everything it can to prolong the war, and they're trying to, do everything they can to try to divide and rule. That's sort of Netanyahu's modus operandi in every single incident on a whole range of issues, or anything that you would touch. So here again, you can see a sort of attempt to divide and rule between Qatar and Egypt, but I would say that it's not necessarily coming from the Qataris or the Egyptians. And
the divide and rule we saw in that report was between Israelis themselves, for or against the sacking of the head of domestic intelligence. At the end of the day, do Israelis have the stomach for a prolonged war?
No, but I think, again, that the divide and rule is Netanyahu sowing the divide and rule. He's really divided society. So I think you need to look at where it's coming from, this division. Netanyahu and his cronies are trying to, who are now in government, to erode the judiciary completely. I mean, the legislature and the executive are the same in Israel. So the only separation of powers is between the legislature and the
Nomi Bar Yaakov, I'm going to interrupt you because it's breaking news. The Supreme Court in the last minutes, according to our correspondent, saying that the sacking of the head of the Shin Bet is illegal. Yes. How will that go down?
Yes, well, it's not surprising. It is illegal. I mean, I'm a lawyer, as you know, and I would have told, it's very clear that it is illegal. There's a committee that is supposed to decide whether the head of the Shin Bet, the internal security forces, if there's any issue with him, it's supposed to go to the committee, including, if there's any issue of confidence. And Netanyahu refused to go to the committee. So Netanyahu refused to follow the procedures that are, written in stone. So time and time again, Netanyahu is trying to act outside the law. So no, it's going to be a pivotal moment yet again in the division. And I really think Israel is potentially on the brink of a civil war.
A civil war, nothing less. Eberhard Kindler, let me ask you though, is this a historic low between Egypt and Israel since the Camp David Accords?
There have been other lows. It's not the first one. I'm not quite sure whether it's historical. There may be others, perhaps, in the future. We don't know yet. But just to come back to the issue of the troops, I think in my mind, this seems to be completely made up. I mean, the only armed forces in the Middle East at the moment that really count are the Israeli armed forces. We see it every day. We see it in Lebanon. We see it in Syria. We see it, of course, in Gaza. We see it all over the place. The Egyptian armed forces, and there are even American congressional reports, which probably Timothy remembers better than I do, but which put the finger on the dysfunctioning aspects of the Egyptian armed forces. It's a huge army, but it's an army that has not the necessary equipment, not the necessary training, and that, of course, more important than anything else, is doing, the officers especially, they are busy in business and not in the armed forces.
I don't know if Emmanuel Macron planned this, Bertrand Besancenot, but the fact that he goes to the Sinai and the cameras follow him, again, it shows there are no troops there, right? So was that part of his signaling?
No, I don't think so. Clearly, he wanted to make a clear sign of sympathy for the humanitarian situation in Gaza. So going on the spot was a clear sign that, as he's sometimes seen as pro-Israeli or having some more understanding when he made, for example, this proposal of a coalition against the Hamas. But there has been in the Middle East some people who were criticizing his position. No, he wants to show that on this aspect, first, he's sensitive to the humanitarian terrible situation. And second, don't forget that there is a French and Saudi initiative for the next June in New York, which is to have an international conference on the two-state solution. And clearly, he wanted to discuss that with President Sisi, with the King of Jordan. I know that there are a lot of discussion between the French side and the Saudi and the Qatari as well to prepare this conference. So it is an opportunity both to show a sense of sympathy for the humanitarian catastrophe nowadays, but also to prepare what could be a long-term solution for the Palestinian situation. So this is clear.
All right, Emmanuel Macron.
Can I come in on this?
Sure, Timothy Collis, go ahead.
In general, what we've seen from Netanyahu for the duration of this conflict and even before it is that he's been something of an agent of chaos. So when I was on this program at the beginning of the war on Gaza in 2023, we speculated that he had a vested interest in the perpetuation of hostilities to avoid being held accountable for the corruption case that he was facing. And even when it came to this Qatargate investigation, he had to leave his corruption trial early to go to speak to police investigators about this other scandal. And so he's creating tensions with the Egyptians. He is creating hostility on the border with Syria, despite the fact that the new government has made it very clear they don't want hostilities with the Israelis. He's undermining the political transition in Lebanon by refusing to withdraw. And he's perpetuating the hostilities in Gaza despite the ceasefire agreement that he agreed to, and that could have freed the hostages that remain. And it's because I think at the end of the day, his political survival is linked to the continuation of hostilities indefinitely. Because if there was a reckoning both around his security failures and his corruption and his attempts to dismantle the authorities of the judiciary that predate October 7th and were already a source of enormous domestic tension within Israel, that his days as a political leader might be numbered. But if he can maintain this violence for long enough, perhaps he can move beyond all the scandals that have accumulated. However, they continue to accumulate. And I do wonder whether or not we might finally see the end of Netanyahu as prime minister of Israel. He's been prime minister since I was in middle school.
Well, that is a while. That makes me feel old. Thanks, Timothy. Timothy, let's get back to Benjamin Macron for a second. He's not just there for humanitarian work. He was also there for business. He came with 2 Rafale jets, a reminder of the defense contracts that have been signed. And we saw that trip on Monday in the Cairo metro, a metro run by Paris's public mass transit operator, the RATP. There are the images of Sisi and Macron passing the turnstile with the card. You didn't jump the turnstile like Jacques Chirac did at the inauguration of the station, famously. Timothy called us. Tell us first of all about the Cairo metro and the optics of this scene.
Certainly. I mean, France's economic engagement with Egypt has been extensive throughout Sisi's tenure. And it started really when, after the Sisi conducted a coup d'etat and also massacred roughly 1,000 protesters in a single day, the Obama administration at the time started to delay the delivery of arms to Egypt and start to increase conditionality on the transfer of those weapons. And so the Egyptians, to kind of diversify their sources of armaments and reduce their reliance on the United States, pivoted and made a huge order of Rafale fighter jets, which was important at the time because the production line of those jets was at risk of being halted entirely because there was no international orders at the time. And Sisi rescued the production line by making this order. And this kind of began a very strong relationship between France and Egypt on arms sales. And in a parliamentary report between 2012 and 2021, Egypt ordered 12.3 billion euros of arms, while the entire EU combined only ordered 12.6. So Egypt invested heavily in this relationship, but at the time also accumulated enormous debt, which is which has brought the state to the brink of insolvency in the past couple of years.
And tell us about the metro. What's it like?
It seems to be nicer than the previous ones. It has air conditioning, so that's exciting, I think, for everybody.
Okay. The Cairo leg also included an unannounced visit to the famed Khan El Khalil souk, the market, the old market, which includes the fabled Fishawi Cafe. These images making for memes aplenty on Egyptian social media. Eberhard Kindler, your reaction when you look at those images there of that visit to the souk?
Well, I mean, once again, I think we are here it's a visit which is a large, an important gesture to the Gazans, to the Egyptians. It's very important, but it does not change that much on the ground, really. Not necessarily politically with regard to Gaza, not necessarily for the Egyptians, because if we say, and Timothy, once again, he mentioned the Rabat Adawiya massacre when Sisi came to power, we are here in a country in which not everybody is able to go to the Fishawi Cafe. People are living through an enormous economic crisis, which has been precipitated by the government itself, which also, of course, ultimately does not strengthen the Egyptian position internationally. Egypt is today basically a bankrupt country, as is Jordan. We got in the new budget between 53 or 50 to 57% of the revenue, of expenditure, which goes into debt service and repaying debt accumulated by this particular government.
Huge.
So, which is huge. So we are talking about a country which is certainly very pleasant to be in for a tourist or for a day or two, but for the majority of Egyptians is not a very pleasant place to be, apart from the repression, and the same applies to Jordan. And that is, of course, something that we also need to take into account when we think about a plan B and when we think about supporting an initiative, which is an Egyptian, Jordanian, French initiative. We should not forget what happens in these countries, and that, of course, does not strengthen necessarily these initiatives.
Bertrand Besancenot?
No, it is absolutely true that you have these economic difficulties both in Egypt and in Jordan. But for exactly this reason, the Gulf countries are particularly important because not only for the political reason, I talked about the deal between Mohammed bin Salman and President Trump on the Palestinian case, but also to assist both Egypt and Jordan. All of us know that it will be the Gulf countries that not only have been doing, but will keep doing an assistance to these two countries because they are, in particular Egypt, are too big to fail, and clearly they are important for the stability of the whole region. So just to say that the role of the Saudis and the Gulf in general, but the Saudis in particular, will be huge in the coming weeks and months on both the economic side, the humanitarian and the political side.
Just a quick question, absolutely. A quick reaction to what Eberhard Kindler just said, which is, talking about how there's the whole humanitarian, human rights aspects of it. Last time that Macron went to Egypt, the French press talked a lot about it. Am I right in saying that they're talking less about it this time?
I would say that in a world where the human rights are everywhere or nearly in a bad situation, I have the feeling that the focus in the media are in general less putting on this question, because we can see what Putin is doing, we can see what Netanyahu is doing. We know that President Trump is not interested in human rights. So there is a way, I don't know if it is seeing that they can't do much about it, but there is something like that that does exist. But it doesn't mean that President Macron didn't say a word about human rights. Maybe and sometimes it is more efficient when you do things in a discreet way than when you are doing it in a public way.
Final word on this. Timothy Caldis, ordinary Egyptians, are they happy Macron came or indifferent?
I mean, I think some people might be happy to see him, but overall indifferent. I mean, the suffering of the population, as Eberhard was alluding to, has intensified substantially with the economic deterioration. And there are also, I think, a lot of Egyptians who fear that the financial support that Egypt is receiving from the West is in part for their complicity in what's happening in Gaza, and that fear is widespread. And so there's a lot of Egyptians who have mixed feelings, at the very least, if not concerns, about seeing these Western leaders embracing President Sisi while the population of Gaza suffers so immensely.
We'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. Timothy Collis, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Barcelona. Nomi Bar Yaakov for being with us from Delphi in Greece. Bertrand Besancenot, Eberhard Kindler, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.